This is a review of the first book, so I'm going to cover pages 6 through 13 in this lesson, just as a quick review. It's really important that you understand what's going on and you know the names of all these symbols and what they mean and all that junk. Okay. So we'll just go over them briefly. If you really you don't understand any of this, please go through book 1. Just go through the whole book again. And make sure you understand it before you go on. Otherwise, you just get confused and then you give up and quit. On page 6, they talk about note values. We have the list of notes there on the left side, starting with the whole note. And yes, you should already know what all those notes are. Now, the bottom, the 2/8 notes are beamed together. This is just one way of doing it. They could have beamed them together. They could have had separate flags, although you usually don't see that in music. They usually beam them together, either according to the beat or according to the feel. And that's easier to talk about when we get to some music and we can feel something. On the left side, or the right side, excuse me, left, right, whichever, you get the rest, because for every note there is a rest. So you have the whole rest on down to the 8th rest. Now we don't beam 8th rests together. Those are always done separately. Usually if it's 2/8 rest, a lot of times they'll just combine them and turn it into a quarter rest instead. Now the one they've left out, which they could have put in if they wanted to, was the dotted half rest. Because every note gets a rest and you can have a dotted rest. Probably won't see any, or you haven't seen any yet, is why they didn't put them in. But it's simply a half rest shown there with a dot behind it. Or any rest can have a dot behind it. It works the same way as the dotted note as far as counting goes. Now on page 7, they give time signatures. 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4 is what we have so far. As long as you understand what the numbers mean, it doesn't matter what they are. They could be anything. They could be 12/1 for all that matter. The top number simply tells you how many counts in a measure or how far you have to count. And the bottom number tells you what you're counting or what note gets a count or a beat or a pulse, whatever. Pulse is a little misleading because we can have pulses other than beats, so let's watch out there. And if you're curious, 12/1, that key signature, that means 12 notes, 12 beats in a measure, and a whole note gets a count. So there's the same as 12 whole notes in a measure. That's why you don't see it too often. But the point is, in theory, it could be there. It could happen. In counting them, it's 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if there's 8th notes involved, I just put an and in between the numbers. So instead of 1, 2, 1, 2, it's 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. And each of those 1 and 2 and are 8th notes, or the same as 8th notes, or 8th rests, whichever. Different people count 8th notes differently. And remember that the whole rest gets double duty. It can represent the same as a whole note as far as counting goes, or it can just represent the whole measure, regardless of how many counts are in the measure. On page 8, we get the clef signs, then the grand staff. Okay, clef signs, you have treble and bass. The treble is also known as a G clef. Keep that in mind because it points out where the note G is on the staff. The bass clef is also known as an F clef because it points out where the note F is on the staff. That's all. The G on the treble clef, it curls around toward the bottom of it. It curls around in that line that goes right through the middle of it. That's the G. And for the bass clef, the 2 dots, the line that goes between them, that's the F. If you know where one note is, you can figure out all the others. We don't do that. We memorize them, because you don't have time to figure them out. They show you the notes on the staves at the bottom of the page and which key on the piano they go to. Again, I expect you to just know those by now. Seriously, you shouldn't have to write in the name of the note in the music, and you shouldn't need stickers on your keyboard to tell you what the name of the key is by now. Otherwise, you really are not ready for this book yet. Please go through book 1 carefully. Now the grand staff at the bottom of the page. Pretend the notes are not there. All we have is this other stuff. You got, in this case, 2 staves. You could have 3, but 2, okay, 2 staves. They're connected with a line at the beginning. That tells you you're going to play the stuff in both staves at the same time when that line connects them. If the line were not connecting them, then you'd play the notes in the top staff first and then the notes in the bottom staff. But when the line connects them, you do them all. It has that curly brace in front of it, and that's what identifies it as a grand staff. All grand staffs have that curly brace. Any instrument that needs a lot of notes uses a grand staff. The clef signs shown here are treble and bass, but understand that's not always the case. I mean, you need a clef sign to tell you what notes are in the staff, but it's not always going to be treble and bass. It could be treble and treble, or bass and bass, or treble and bass, or could be some sort of a C clef. We haven't had C clefs yet. Those are fun. Yeah, it could be, but there needs to be some clef there to tell you what the notes are in the staff. On page 9, we get into dynamic marks. Dynamics is simply the louds and softs. How loud or how soft are you playing? And that's what makes piano such a valuable instrument, because before they couldn't control louds and softs. It was all just the same. And when piano came along, suddenly they had a lot more control over the music. Changed everything. They give the symbols there and the Italian word for them and what it means and all that junk. I assume you know what these are. They're not absolute values. They're a range that depends on your situation, because soft in one place might be loud in another. If I'm in a small room like this, soft is pretty soft. But if I'm outside in a large amphitheater or something, soft might be loud here. You have to adjust the dynamic for the situation you're in. That's why I don't really teach too much on dynamics in these lessons, because it's up to you. What do you think it is? As far as playing them, I use weight, controlled weight to play the piano, and the softer the note needs to be, the lighter it is. And the louder it needs to be, the heavier it is. And that's how I control it. And it takes time to gain that kind of control. They give you a study at the bottom of the page with these dynamic symbols. It's start out soft, and you have the hairpins to gradually get louder, and then another one to gradually get softer. And when you have these matching hairpins, we call these, I call them, a lot of people call them, not just me, a swell. Swell up and back down. So you look in the middle of this hairpins to see what is there, and that's your target. That's where you're headed. Here, these are the notes. But if I gradually get louder, going up and back down. It's swell up and swell down. How much you get louder, that depends on the music. Sometimes it tells you, and sometimes, like here, it doesn't. It's up to you on how much, just louder. Then you get PP for the half notes. It's very soft, and then it's still soft, but a little softer, a little louder. Then moderately soft, moderately loud, loud. And then the last measure is P again, soft. Yeah, that's sort of an idea of the dynamics. Hopefully, when you're learning a piece of music, you get good enough and comfortable enough with the notes and everything that you start feeling the dynamics. That's really where it happens. Because the dynamics given in most music is sort of a skeleton thing. It's not all of it. You can do more with dynamics than what's shown in the music in most cases. On page 10, they talk about intervals. It's just like, okay, just how complicated do you want to make it? Interval, remember, is the distance between any two notes. Could be the first note of the piece and the last note of the piece, but the distance between them, harmonically, is their interval. And you simply count up. Start with the note you're on, that's 1. Don't start with 0. Start with 1 and you simply count up. And whatever number you end up with, that's the interval. So if I have a note here and a note here, I want to know the interval, I count up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's an interval of a ninth. Sounds wonderful, don't it? Okay. Some intervals are really, really important. They're used a lot. And some intervals, like a ninth, is not used that much because it doesn't sound all that comfortable. And you'll see them in music too. You'll learn to recognize the smaller intervals in music. They cover seconds and thirds here. And if you're curious, if you just have one note, it's the distance of it to itself. That's called a unison. Yeah, whatever. Throw a little extra in there. Now we have different flavors of intervals. Don't worry about that. We're just dealing with the numbers right now. If they're at the same time, let's take a third. If they're at the same time, it's called a harmonic interval. The harmony. You can hear the harmony is when you hear 2 or more notes at a time. If it's one note then the other, or whichever, that's called a melodic interval. It's like a melody, is one note after another. It's a melodic interval. On page 11, they cover the 4th, 5th, and 6th in music. You can have fun. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask. On page 12, they talk about the key of C major. I have a lot of different harmonies. We group these by keys, key signatures, so forth. C major is all the white keys. Generally, we start with C major because it's easy to see it. It's all the white keys. The pattern is easy to see. And a scale, we talk about the scale. Scale is simply a set pattern of whole steps and half steps. And you see the pattern really well with C major. That's why we started. Go C to C, any C, doesn't matter. And all the white keys. And you can see where the whole steps are because that's where the black keys are. Because a whole step, remember, is 2 half steps. A half step's the next note up or down. That's a half step. Half step, half step. Well, there's 2 half steps. That's a whole step. It's got a black key. So we got a whole, half, whole, half. And that's a pattern for any major scale. Whole, half, whole, half, and steps. And that's it. I cover this in more detail in the scale videos. It would be better, in my opinion, if you went to the scale video, do the introductory scale, the video, watch it, and then do what I explain in the scale video. Just the beginner part now, the up and down 1 octave until you're comfortable with the scale and you know what notes are in it. The primary chords for C major, well, what are the primary chords? Okay, in a scale, going back to C major, every note in the scale, leave off the top, there's 7 of them, because the 8th one is 1 again. Every one is numbered. We call them steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3, blah, blah, blah. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're all numbered. Well, if I build a chord on that step, any step, then that is the number of the chord. And a chord is every other note for 3. We're using 3-note chords here, just like here. 3-note chords. Every other note in the scale. So we're in C major, it's all the white keys. Well, the bottom note identifies the chord when it's in this arrangement. And because we're starting on step 1 of the scale, this is a 1 chord in the key of C major. It would be a different number in some other key, but in C major it's a 1 chord. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 1 again. Some chords are more important and used more often than other chords, and those are the primary chords. There's 3 of them. 1, the 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5 chord, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And usually with the 5 chord, we'll add a 7th on top of it, so it is a 5/7 chord. So what's a 7th? Well, you take the chord, and from the bottom note, you add an interval of a 7th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That note. It's, again, every other note. So there's 4 notes in that one. It's a 5/7 chord in the key of C major. And those are the primary chords for the key of C major. Or I could say 1, 4, and 5/7 are the primary chords in any key. And as far as the notes, it depends on what the key is, because you go to that step number to get it. Now we use what's known as a close position, because on piano, if I go 1, 4, 5, 7, 1, I'm moving around. Well, I can get all these chords without moving around so much, and that's a close position. So on a 4 chord here, if I take the C and I put it on the bottom, then I'm close to this. All I did was the C's here. I just went up to here. See, I didn't move around. I got it. And for the 5/7 chord, well, the 5/7 chord is here. We like to use at least 3 notes, most cases. You don't need all 4. You could if you wanted to. It's not necessary. We need the top and bottom note, because that's really important. And you could use either one of the other notes. Doesn't matter which one. Most of the time we will use the B. here. And all we need to do is put the G on top. So it's this. So I'm going from a 1 to 5/7. The little finger comes down a half step, and I'm using the top two notes in the position. So it's a 1, 4, 5, 7, 1. I get all these chords without moving around much. So that's generally how we're going to see them a lot in music. It just comes in handy. You should do it in both hands. 1, 4, 5, 7, 1. Yeah. Now let's go to G major on page 13. Well, it's the same mess I was talking about on page 12, except now in the key of G, we have one sharp, an F sharp. And you can figure that out real quick if you just do the whole half step pattern. Start on G here, any G, doesn't matter, here. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Just follow that. Whole, 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 half, whole, 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 half. See, it ends up with the F sharp in there. It's there. So those are the notes in the key of G major. It has one sharp in the key signature. If you know the scale, then you get the key signature in the music. You don't have to really worry about which note is sharped. You just play the notes in the scale for G major and you got it. That's how I've been doing it for a long time. It really comes in handy when you get 4, 5, and 6 sharps or flats in a key signature. I don't think about which one I'm doing. I just play the stuff in the scale. And the primary chords are the same, 1, 4, and 5, 7, except now we're on G. So G, one chord, and then the 4 chord, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember that was a 1 chord in the key of C. Well, it's a 4 chord in the key of G. And then the 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't forget the F sharp, it's in the key. And then add the 7th, so it's a 5, 7. And those are the primary chords, and then we just change them. We invert them, it's called inverting them. When we rearrange them, stuff like this, so we're not moving the hand around. So it's here, the top two fingers go up for the 4 chord. And for the 5, 7, the little finger goes down a half step here and use the top 2 in the position. Do it in both hands. Alright, so you get them a lot in music. You gradually get to know them rather well, actually, but I still prefer that you go to my scale video on scales and do those. Do whatever key of the piece you're working on, whatever scale you're working on in the key. Yeah. Let me know if you have questions, but again, we're going to be reviewing more and more as we go through, but we're going to be adding stuff. So it's important that you at least understand what we've covered in this lesson.